Hello everyone, welcome to today's webinar and welcome to the first webinar we're hosting on Google Hangouts. I'm just going to start the presentation in a minute. I think some people are still logging in, and so we'll get started in just a second. Okay, so we're going to get started with the webinar. The topic today is features. So I'm sure a lot of you have heard of the features module before. It's a really popular Drupal module for organizing your configuration. And my name is Suzanne Dergachova. I'm working here at Evolving Web. We're a Drupal development and consulting shop, and we also have a Drupal training program. So in addition to these webinars, we also do a lot of live trainings, in-person trainings. You can find out more at evolvingweb.ca/training. And we have a couple upcoming intro Drupal trainings, one in Toronto in August, in a couple weeks, and one in September in Montreal. And there's also another webinar coming up in a couple weeks. So if you're interested in any of those, you can go to evolvingweb.ca/training to find out more. For today's webinar, if you have questions in the Google Hangout, you should see a panel on the right side where you can ask questions. If not, you can also go over to the YouTube page for this broadcast, and you can ask questions there. So I'll check that sort of closer to the end of the presentation. But feel free to ask either way. And then you can also always follow up with questions via email if there's anything that we don't have time to get to. So the topic of the webinar today is features, and features is a tool for organizing your Drupal configuration and sort of managing it. And so the reason that we need a module for this is because of an inherent problem in content management systems in general. So this is true of site configuration in Drupal, but it's also true for other content management systems that you probably used. So normally when you're configuring a Drupal website, a lot of the configuration you're doing is through the administrative interface. So you're pointing and clicking to make changes, to do things like add fields, set up content types, create users, set up the configuration for all of your modules, and every time you make a configuration setting, if you look in the database, you can actually see that Drupal's adding tables to the database, or it's adding maybe a new row or new column, or something's happening in the database when you're making those changes. So even though it's a content management system that has a database and code, making changes to the configuration, that always gets saved in the database. So if you look at what gets saved in the database, like especially if you actually open up the database and start looking through it, you'll find a lot of things in there. So you'll find site-wide variables, the name of your site, what the front page of your site is. You'll also find a lot of configurations. So you'll find components like views and content types and translations, things that are really key to the functioning of your site. And then you'll also find content and things that are kind of like content. So things like menu items and blocks, which you might not think of as always as content, but it's definitely the type of thing that's changing on a regular basis. And it's the type of thing that an author or an administrator on your site might come along and add. And all of this is mixed together in the same database. So typically when you're working on a Drupal website, you need the code of the website for it to work, but you also need the database. And without the database, you're going to be missing all of your customizations, all of the configuration that you've worked on when you were building the site. And so typically when you're working on a Drupal site and you want to give the site to someone else to look at, or you want to launch your website, or you want to work on the website with another developer, you'll need to send them a database dump along with the code. So it's not just enough to send them the code, you also need to send them the database. And this works okay if you're one person working on a Drupal site, but it becomes a problem when you start collaborating with other people or after you've launched your site and you still want to make some updates to your configuration. It also makes it hard to reuse your configuration or to share it or distribute it with other people. And so these are all reasons why the features module is so popular, because it's used to address all of these things. So I'm going to focus on the first two challenges here, challenges of collaborating when you're working on a Drupal project, and also the challenge of what to do after your site is launched. The third one I'll talk about a little bit later on. So first of all, if you're working with other developers and you're both making changes, you're probably making changes to the code, but also to the database. And there's not really a way for you to merge your database changes together because the database is not meant for that. It's not meant to be merged and diffed and put into version control. And so usually only one person can make changes to the database at a time. So what we really need is a way to share configuration without sharing the database back and forth. And after your site is launched, what you'll end up with is your version of the website that's online, that's live, that people can visit. And then you'll also have the version of the database that's in your development environment that you're working on a regular basis, making updates to. And typically, if it's a important website, you don't want to just make configuration changes on the live website, because as we all know, a simple change to views or to a content type can really break your site. So you don't want to just be experimenting with configuration on your live website. Instead, you want to make the configuration changes on your development website. So normally what happens if you're working on a development website is that the code changes are really easy to move over. You can commit the code changes to Git if you're using Git for your version control, or you can transfer them maybe via FTP or something up to your live website. And then on your live website, you have content being added. Maybe people are commenting on your site and creating user accounts and things like that. So the version of the database on your live website is the master version, or the version that's the most important, the one that you really want to hold on to. So typically, you'll occasionally move or copy your master database from the live website back to your development website. So that's normally how things work. But with configuration, it kind of goes against the flow. It's something that you want to work on your development website, and then when it's ready, move it over to your live website. So that dotted line there for configuration, that's something that Drupal core doesn't give us a way to do. We don't have a way in Drupal core to just take the configuration out of the database and move it over to a different database. So this is really the problem that we're facing here, is how do you move configuration around? How do you transfer the configuration to the live website when it's ready? So there's a few options that you have, and features is one of them, but there's a couple others that we'll start with. So just to think through this, if you're working on a really simple website and you don't have time to set up features or you don't know about features, maybe you just decide to write down all the steps for the configuration. So as you're installing a new language on your website or as you're adding a new content type, you go through and you keep track of everything that you're doing. And then when you've done all the testing, you reproduce these steps on the live site. So you go to your live site and you actually do the configuration there. And this works okay if you have really simple changes that you want to make. Maybe you want to add a new permission to a user role, or you just want to enable a really simple module that does one thing. So these types of things work fine with this approach. But the problem is that if you have a more complicated configuration to set up, like installing a language, it's quite a few steps. It's easy to make a mistake. It can also take a long time if you have something like views that can take quite a bit of pointing and clicking to configure. And it also doesn't work if you have a staging and a testing environment, because then you'd have to do these changes multiple times. And you might have inconsistencies between them. And finally, you can't deploy a bunch of changes at once using this approach because you're going to end up allowing people to view the site when the change is halfway through. So for example, installing a language, if you just install a language, the first step is to add the language to the site, and then you'll view the language in the language switcher, but there won't be any translations there yet. So another option that you have for certain types of configuration is to export the configuration and import it into your live website. So for things like views or panels or contexts, you'll notice that these components in Drupal, they often have a little export link that you can use to export the component as basically text. So you have a bunch of text that defines the view or the context, and you can import that into your live website. For things like content types, you don't have this functionality by default, but there is a module called bundle copy that you can use to export and import content types. So this is actually a really good solution, but it does have a few things that it doesn't cover. For example, you can't see the dependencies between these components that you're importing and exporting. So if you set up a new content type and you add a view and you add a context, you're going to end up with some dependencies between these things. So you have to actually add the content type before you add the view that displays the content type. And if you're just copying and pasting, you're not going to see these dependencies, so it might become kind of confusing. It's also hard to track the differences between what you're importing and what's in the database. So again, if there's a lot of configuration that you're managing this way, and there's a lot of people editing the website, you might end up overriding somebody's work without realizing it. And finally, not everything is exportable in this way. So it kind of depends on who's written the module and what type of component it is. And so there's lots of things that you can't export this way. So the third solution, and the one we're going to focus on today, is using features. So using features, you can, it's really similar to the approach I just described. You have all of these components on your site that you've been working on, and you can use features to turn those into a special kind of module called a feature. And that module is stored in code. And so you can move that code over to your live website, and all of those components will be then available on the live website. And this works with a situation where you have a dev website and a live website. It could also work if you're still working on the website and I have a version and you have a version and I want to share my configuration with you. So in either of these cases, you can use features to share the configuration. There are a bunch of problems with this approach as well, so features is not perfect solution. You have to have more technical knowledge to use features, because typically these changes are going to end up in code, and so you'll need to use version control to move the changes over from one version of the website to another. You can also run into conflicts if you have a lot of features installed on the same site. So even though there's a user interface for managing features, you'll often need to actually look at the code to see if there's a problem. And sometimes you'll have components that depend on content in your site. So if you have a view that's filtering based on a certain taxonomy term, or if you have a panels page that's displaying a certain node on your site, these components are depending on content. And so if you don't have that same content on both versions of your site, then you'll run into issues when you're moving over the feature. And finally, and this is an important one to keep in mind, it's really tricky to take components out of features. So I'm going to talk more about how features works in a minute, but it's really easy to put things into features, but sometimes it's harder to take them out. So it's not a perfect solution, and so it's important to keep that in mind as you're starting to use it. So how does features work? Features, as I said, it allows you to take components and turn them into this special kind of module called a feature. So you have, for example, if you have a website that has articles on it, then you might end up with a view to display the articles and a context to determine the layout of article pages, as well as your article content type. What features allows you to do is create a new feature which contains all of these components. So the user interface looks something like this. You're able to select the components that you want to add to the feature, and then at the bottom of the page there's this download feature link. And as you add components here, features fills in the blanks for you. So if you decide that you want to add the article content type to your feature, features is going to figure out which fields are part of the article content type, and it'll automatically add those for you. And so when you click download feature, features is actually going to give you a module that you can install on your site that includes all of these components. So for our example, if we have a multilingual articles feature that we've developed, the files might look something like this. So it's nothing to be afraid of. If you're not used to looking at Drupal code, it's just a module like any other module that you might download. It has an info file which includes a list of all the modules that you need to install the feature and all the components that the feature includes. So the list of fields, the list of content types, the list of taxonomies, or vocabularies, whatever you've included in your feature. You have a module file, but it's really simple. It just has a reference to say that this module is a feature. And then all of the other files are just going to include the components that you've included in the feature. So a few slides ago we saw that if you export a view, you get this dump of text that defines the view. That's exactly what ends up in the feature when you create a feature that includes the view. Okay, sorry about that. So we have this feature that we've downloaded, and as I said, you can install it just like you would install a module. So normally if you install a module, you're probably going to put it in your site under Sites All Modules. You might want to keep your features in a subfolder just to keep them all organized, but you don't have to. If you put them under Sites All Modules, then they're going to show up on your features page where you manage all your features. They're not going to show up on your modules page. They're just going to show up here because features knows that these are features. And this is where you can enable the module or enable the features. So the checkboxes here, they're just like the checkboxes on the modules page, so you can check them off to install them. You'll see that the default, the state here for these features is set to default. So state is something that becomes really important as you're making updates to your features and managing your features. But when you first install a feature, the state is going to be default. And that means that what you have in your database is the same as what you have in the feature itself. So if you install your feature on the same website where you created the configuration, it's going to be exactly the same, what's in the database and what's in the feature. You can also install your features on other Drupal websites. So as long as you have the right modules installed for the dependencies for the feature, you can go and take this feature and install it on another version of your website. One other thing I'll just mention before I move on. So features, as you can see, they are modules. They have info files and module files. And you can add code to them just like you can add code to your regular modules. So if you put hook implementations in your module file, those will get picked up if the feature is installed. So occasionally you'll want to do that. It's not going to be something you probably do with the first feature you make, but it might be something that becomes useful in organizing your site. So what can you put in features? I've just talked about a really simple example here, creating an articles feature. There's lots of other things that you can put in your features. So in addition to content types and fields and taxonomy and views, there's lots of other modules that you'll install that are going to add to the list of components that you can put in features. So things like rules, search API, WYSIWYG, these are all types of things that you're going to be able to put into your features. One thing that's also could be useful to put into your features are site-wide variables. So things like the site name or the site slogan or the setting for clean URLs or any site-wide setting that ends up in your variables table that a module defines. These are things that you might want to put into your features. So there's a separate module called StrongArm that you can use to do this. So it integrates really well with features. If you just enable the module, it's going to add StrongArm as one of the types of components that you can put into your features. So creating features is pretty simple. You go and you select your components, you download the features, and you install them. The tricky part comes when you make updates to your features and you start developing a workflow for changing the configuration using features. So as I mentioned before, when you first install a feature, if the database and the feature itself have exactly the same configuration, then you're going to have a feature in a default state. And that's going to show up when you see your list of features. But as soon as you start making changes to the configuration that's stored in these features, then you're going to end up with an overridden state. So you make your changes through the administrative UI. These changes are going to happen in the database, and then all of a sudden the database and your feature are going to be out of sync. And now the state is called overridden. And you'll see that when you go to your list of features, there'll be a little flag that says overridden. And so now you have to kind of decide what you want to do. You've made some changes in the database. Do you want to keep those in your feature, or do you want to revert back to what's in the code? And when you're making that decision, a really useful tool is the ability to review your overrides. So to actually view what's different, what you've changed when you've gone through and configured something new in the site. And if you have the diff module installed, you'll be able to actually view the differences. So if you were using features, you have to install the diff module. It's going to really help you out. And it'll give you this tab to review your overrides. So before you decide whether you want to add these changes into your feature, you'll want to review them first. Go through line by line. And this is essential that you do this, because otherwise you might end up inadvertently adding things to your features. So there's two things that you can do when you have an overridden feature. You can either revert the feature, which means reverting to what's in the database, reverting the database to what's in code. So reverting means going back to what's actually in the code of the feature. So if you've added a field, reverting is going to delete that field. And then if you recreate the feature and you incorporate the changes, then what you're doing is you're updating the code to reflect the changes that you've made in the database. So you can select which ones you want to, which additional components you would want to include. And recreating means that any components that you've already added, the configuration for those will end up in code. So if you're working in, if you're creating a workflow where you're making changes to your configuration on your dev site and you want those to go up on your live site, then you can go ahead and make those changes on your dev site, recreate the feature, make sure you're exporting all of your changes to code, and then you'll pull in the code changes on your live site and revert the feature to get those changes. So it's really important to sort of think through these steps, and often having a dev website and a live website isn't enough. You'll also want to have some kind of a staging site to test what happens when you pull in the code changes and revert the feature, just to make sure that everything's good to go. And one really important thing here is to keep the database on your development site up to date, because if there's interactions between your feature and your database, you want to make sure that that's going to work the same way in your development environment and in your live environment. So just always making sure that the database is up to date. It's really important. So to look at a diagram for a more sort of sophisticated environment here, we have an events feature, and we have our database on our development, staging, and production servers. And the feature itself, you're going to be committing the changes and pushing that and pulling in the changes on staging and production. And then the database, always from production, is going to be pushed back to staging and development. So this is all very well. You have your ability now to create features, to manage them, to make changes, to push those changes, and then revert to what's in code. But I can tell you that if you're doing all of this through the user interface, it's going to become a little bit tedious. Usually it takes a lot of testing, and sometimes you'll want to see what your feature is going to look like before you recreate it. And so it's really useful to use features with Drush. So Drush is the essential Drupal command line tool that you'll want to be using if you're doing a lot of Drupal development. And if you install features, you're going to get a bunch of new Drush commands for managing those features. So you can find documentation for this on Drupal.org at node 960926. And so you'll see all of the commands there with a bit more documentation and some examples. But the most common commands that you're going to use are Drush features export, which is for actually creating a feature. And you're going to use that to define which components you want to include in your feature. So here in my example, if you use Drush features export custom articles, then the two strings that follow are node : article. That means that you want to include your article content type as part of the feature. And then views view articles. That means you also want to include the articles view. So you can use this command to create a new feature. You can also use it to recreate a feature. And if you include additional components, then you'll be adding those components to the feature. Remember what I said earlier, it's really easy to add components to your features. There's no easy command for remove these components from the feature. So it's just something to keep in mind as you're happily adding components to your features using Drush. And then the other two commands, we have Drush features update custom articles. So that's going to take the configuration from your database and put it into code. So you can see what that looks like. And then you have Drush features revert, which is going to revert the configuration from your code, revert the configuration from your database back to what's in code. So any changes that you've made in the database are going to be reverted. And then along with this, if you're using Git, of course you'll want to make sure that you're doing a diff to make sure that the changes are exactly what you're expecting before you commit them and move them over to another version of the site. So it's pretty easy to set up a single feature, and you might be tempted to use a single feature for all of the configuration on your site. But you do have some options in terms of what you put into features and how you organize those features, and it's worth planning it through and thinking about what the workflow is going to be, how you're actually going to use these features, what configuration is going to change and what's going to stay the same. So planning your features before you just start madly creating them is pretty important. So things that should stay in features are things that probably aren't going to change a lot, or that if it does change, it's going to take a bit of work and require some time from a Drupal developer or site builder planning out the change. Configuration of things that only developers would change, so something like configuring your search API. That's something that really takes a lot of technical knowledge. It's not something that you're going to be probably fiddling with on the live site. It's something that's definitely going to be planned. So that's ideal for putting into features because it's something that you'll be testing and then moving it over to the live site. Or if you're developing the site and you're collaborating, maybe that's something that one person's going to work on for a couple days. They're going to go and work on that feature, and then they're going to share it with the rest of the team. So it's important to think about the workflow for how changes are going to happen on the site after it's launched. So if you have things that site administrators are going to change, if these site administrators don't know how to use features, they don't know how to commit code to your repo and test it and then move it over to the live site, then it's probably something that should stay out of features. So things like the home page blocks. Maybe you're using panels, maybe you're using context, but that's something that site admins might want to change really quickly, and so putting it into features is going to make it a lot harder for them to change that. There's different ways that you can structure your features. So maybe you want to have one feature for everything. The drawback of this is that normally only one person is going to edit a feature at a time. So if you're a group of people working on a website, having one feature for everything is going to make it hard to collaborate on configuration. So an alternative is to have one feature per section of the site, maybe one for each content type. Maybe you'll have, in a single feature, you'll have a content type, a view, and a panel that are all related. So there's different ways of doing this. You'll also find it's quite common to have one feature that's used to set up the defaults for the site. So this might have a bunch of site-wide settings and a bunch of things like image cache presets that are used throughout, various content types on the site. So for this example, we have a separate feature for the defaults for the site that has all the variables in it. We have one for events, a careers section, and an articles section. And then stuff that you might not want to put into features would be things like menu items, because admins might want to change those, reorder the items, change what gets linked to. The homepage panel, if you have a panel that you're using for the homepage, that's something that you probably don't want to put into features if it gets updated. It probably has some content in it as well, maybe some custom content panes, or even just the layout. It's something that might need to get changed quickly. For the sections of the site, those might have panels as well. Maybe those are something that you want to keep out of features. And then also maybe permissions. Maybe you want to be able to sort of iterate on the permissions of your site. You're not sure exactly what they should be at, rather than having to make a commit to a feature every time you want to tweak that. Maybe you just want to keep that out of features. Something you can always put into features later if you change your mind. So that's just one example. Different projects are going to have different requirements, and so you can kind of make your decision. But as I mentioned, it's hard to take things out of features after you've put them in. So once you add a component to a feature, if you just disable that feature, the component's gonna disappear. So to take something out of features, there's some options that I'm going to talk about in a second, but it does take a little bit more work. So there is one other use case for features that I'll talk about, and that's for sharing configuration. So not just sharing amongst your team, but actually sharing with the greater community. So features as a module actually wasn't developed for everything that I've talked about so far, although that's how it's used. It was developed for distributions. So Drupal, if you go to drupal.org/project/distributions, you'll find a whole list of distributions that people have come up with for Drupal. So versions of Drupal that have additional modules and functionality added. Also, these all come with features which provide configuration. So out of the box, with any of these versions of Drupal, you're going to get a bunch of features that give you some configuration to start with. So if you download one of these distributions, you are going to want to make changes. So for example, if you download the Commerce Kickstart distribution, it adds the Commerce module, it adds a bunch of configuration and some sample content to get you started so you can start your online store. But you might want to add your own content types to the distribution. You might want to add fields to content types that already exist. You're definitely going to want to change a bunch of site-wide settings. And if you're in Canada, you might want to add French as one of the languages. And you might want to reconfigure some of the contexts and panels that the distribution defines. So these are all really common things you'll want to do after downloading a distribution. And what'll typically happen is you'll get really excited, you'll start making all these changes, and then you'll go to your features page and you'll see that every feature pretty much on the website is overridden. And now what are you going to do? So these distributions are updated just like modules. There's new releases that come out. And if you want to pull in the changes, you're going to get you're going to get updates to the features that the distribution's provided. So there's a couple approaches that you can take. If you want to be able to pull in the updates and get the updated versions of features, you can use a module called Features Overrides, which allows you to track the difference between the original feature that you got from the distribution and what you've done. So all of the database changes you've made, you'll get a new feature that provides those changes. So you'll be storing them separately, so you'll still be able to update the original features, but you'll still have your changes. And this might not work all of the time, but it's a module that a lot of people use to manage this. A couple other options that you have would be to just get rid of the features that the distribution provides. So if you decide you don't care about the updates that the distribution maintainer is going to push out, you just want to structure your own features and decide how you want to do it. There are a couple tools out there for defeaturizing. So one of them is called Features Tools. So it gives you the ability to take components out of your features. And there's another project, it's just a sandbox project right now, it's called Unfeaturize. So you can get more information about that up on GitHub. Just if you Google Unfeaturize Drupal, you'll find out more. And there's a presentation from Drupal Camp New York. I think it's up on YouTube, and you can find out more about some of the issues with defeaturizing your Drupal site there. Let's see. Okay, so finally I'm going to just talk about some alternatives to features. So if you decide that you don't want to use features for some reason, or the drawbacks are too much and for your use case it doesn't make sense, or maybe you don't want to use it for everything, you just want to use it for certain components on your site, there are some alternatives that I should mention. So importing and exporting components is always an option. This is something I talked about earlier. So things like views, panels, contexts, you can manually import and export these. And for content types, you can use the bundle copy module. And these are things that you can manually import and export. There's a user interface for it. But you can also put these into your custom modules. So if you have a custom module for let's say, registrations on your website, let's say you're setting up a conference website and you have registrations, and you have some views and panels that you want to include with this module. So they're part of the module, and you could put these into features. But rather than dealing with features and the whole workflow with that, you just want to hard code these in your module. So you can export your views and your panels pages, and you can include these using these two hooks. So you can actually provide default views and default panels pages with your module. And then if somebody comes along and makes some changes to the panels or some changes to the views, that's just going to get tracked. So you can still do things like revert the view or revert the panel individually. So that's something you can do right out of the box with your views, panels, modules. And so it'll be really useful to you if you're developing custom modules to do things like that. So that's one approach. You can also use install profiles for some of these things. So if you are creating features that you intend to reuse on many websites, let's say you're a university and you have a whole bunch of mini sites that you're setting up that are very similar in terms of the configuration, it's just the content that's going to be different. You can create an install profile that you can use to define the default configuration and what modules and what theme is going to be installed by default. So this could also be useful if you have a lot of websites that are multilingual that have the same languages and you want those to be installed by default for every site that you're setting up. So that's something you could use features for. You could create a feature that includes the languages and the configuration, or you could just use an install profile. So there's more information about that on Drupal.org if you go to node 102.2020, and it's something you can look into as an alternative for that use case. If you have a bunch of changes that you want to make on your live Drupal site and it's not changes that you necessarily want to put into features, you can write a script to make the changes. So if you're into Drush and you realize that you can make all of these changes through some Drush commands and you just want to do it that way, it's a perfectly good approach. So for something like installing a new language, it might work really well to write a simple Drush script to do that for you. Or if you want to add a new content type and import all the new content for that content type and you just want to do it all at once, again, that's something maybe a Drush script would be good for. Or running an upgrade, that's something you can use Drush scripts for. So lots of use cases and some overlap with features. And then another, if you want to get really advanced, if you're writing custom modules and you want to make some updates to the module, and along with the update, you want to have some new configuration, you can use hook install and hook update to make changes to your module configuration. So hook install would be used for the default configuration for your module when the module is first installed, and hooked update, you can put code in there to make changes to the configuration when the module gets updated and you run update.php. I don't think that many people use this, but you know, it's a tool that's available to you. And finally, if you're really patient and you think that all this stuff is great, but you're frustrated with features, you can just wait for Drupal 8 to come out. A lot of the problems that features is used to solve is resolved in Drupal 8 because of the configuration management initiative. So in Drupal 8, configuration management allows you to export all of your configuration to YAML files, and then those can be imported on your production site or on different versions of your site. So you can find out more about that on Drupal.org. There's some nice diagrams there that describe this. It's fairly similar to how I've been describing how features works. Initially, your configuration is in the database, and then it gets put into the YAML files, and those you can commit and move over to different versions of your site. Configuration management doesn't completely replace what Panels does, because Panels also allows you to package different components into features, and so that packaging aspect isn't there. And so I'm not sure exactly how distributions are going to be set up in Drupal 8, and there will likely be, you know, some type of features module or something similar in Drupal 8 to provide some of that functionality as well. But configuration management is definitely one of the most exciting features of Drupal 8 that a lot of people are looking forward to. So if you have questions, you can feel free to ask them in the Google Hangouts panel, or if you want to go to the YouTube video page, I'll look at the questions there as well. I think there's a bit of a lag on the video, so I'll wait a minute just to start answering and checking if there's any questions. And in the meantime, just to let you know, we do have a Drupal training program. So if you want to learn more about how Drupal works and how you can use it for your projects, you can check out evolvingweb.ca/training. And if you want a training on a certain topic, like you want to spend a whole day learning about features, then please contact me. I'd love to hear your ideas for new training sessions. And we do have some upcoming trainings, intro trainings in Toronto and Montreal, and another webinar in 2 weeks. So hopefully I'll see you at one of those as well. And I'll just go now to see if there are any questions. Comments. Or maybe the questions and comments aren't working, in which case please feel free, if you're not able to ask questions, to email me, and I will do my best to distribute the answers to everyone who signed up for the webinar, and I'll also try and do a follow-up blog post, which might address some of your questions if there's anything that would be good to put in a blog post. And if you have ideas for other webinar topics, that's also something I would love to get your feedback on. So, not seeing any questions appearing, I think I will end the webinar there. So thank you very much for attending, and I look forward to doing this again sometime soon. Thanks.